think we should be careful when anyone's opinion can be connected back to a way for them to increase their power, uh, or resources or power in any sort of way, whether it's directly through money or just some other form of maybe social currency. And what you can discover is that in a lot of ways, people that don't take um, sort of wild or extreme positions aren't going to get generally as much attention. Um, we can look, if we just look into our recent political landscape, we can see the way in which Trump was able to get media attention, um, and how it was kind of like any attention is better than no attention, free publicity, and so on. But this also goes for trying to sell books, for getting attention and controversy or money poured into you, whatever field you're in, to study something that you say is, could lead to the end of the world, or something that you need to do to prevent the end of the world. And I've been thinking about a couple subjects today, still kind of harping on free will, but also climate change. And the more you look into it, the more you'll find that there are endless incentives. We'll start with particularly with climate change. There's endless incentives for people to hype up climate change or to diminish it one way or the other. And I'm not saying that the truth is necessarily on either side or in the middle or whatnot. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I haven't, and I'm not going to dedicate my life to this cause. But it doesn't take much research to figure out that there are very strong incentives that people have to say climate change is a hoax, that it's not important, don't worry about whatever, and that there's just as much incentive with some people to say the opposite. Now you could say, well, maybe then find the people who have less incentive, and I do think that's a good idea. Try to find that. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult to really sort through that and see who doesn't have something to gain by especially if there seem to be saying the end is near, or that it's completely irrelevant. Like I said, that doesn't prove that the middle ground is the right thing. Maybe the end is near. Maybe climate change is totally irrelevant. I don't really know. That's the truth about as far as my knowledge goes. I'm not a climate scientist. I haven't spent a bunch of time researching this, and even if I did, I would know less than the experts, But when we make decisions about our views of reality, we all realize that we have limited time, or even limited intelligence in a lot of cases, or maybe all cases to some degree, to be experts and properly analyze every facet of life. There's different people that know more about different areas of life. Some people know a ton about a lot of areas. Some people know nothing about pretty much anything, right? There's varying degrees of expertise, or just kind of general knowledge and lack of knowledge. But I do think we need to more acknowledge the fact that we do rely on experts for opinions on so many things, and it's important to be skeptical. Now, to what degree, I don't know. I think it's like I could read all these things and watch all these videos on climate change, and you see even like with Al Gore, all his predictions, his big catastrophic predictions that he made in his documentaries, he was wrong. He was wrong, and he also was a hypocrite, and is a hypocrite in so many ways. You can do your own research on on what makes him a hypocrite, but and there obviously he had incentives to do this, right? Money, power, attention, and the danger is you can find people like scientists who were paid by big oil and other things like that, who came up with false studies to say, climate change is not a thing, blah, blah, blah. And then, so the problem is, it's like you see the Al Gore shit, or you see the big oil people, and you're like, oh, the automatic assumption that people will make is, oh, the other side must be right. And this is not necessarily true. And this is the problem with even just politics as a whole. It's like you see the left doing and saying things, lying, manipulating, whatever, and then it makes you want to look to the right. And then the right might be doing the same thing or doing it in a different way. And if you really, in this world that has so much information and there's so much incentive for people to lie, manipulate, and there's so many ways that we can be duped and not even be lying, just actually be genuinely trying to be honest but wrong, it really can be difficult to come to a place of truth. This was making me think about Sam Harris and free will, and I also want to talk about Elon Musk and his idea about simulation theory, or the idea that we're in a simulation. But I'll start with Sam Harris. Sam Harris, I was going to say, I was almost going to imply that he's an idiot, right? That he must be some sort of idiot to think that telling people that we don't have free will is just going to be a good thing, because we'll just feel more sympathetic towards criminals, and that'll be a net positive in the end. And it's just so delusional that I'm like, he's an idiot. But then I realized, wait, this is stupid of me. Sam Harris is obviously a brilliant person. What is more likely, that he's an idiot or a liar? And I think liar. I think what's going to get Sam Harris attention, what's going to get him followers, what's going to get him books sold, is sort of interesting new radical opinions. If he just has some very middle ground idea or nothing that seems groundbreaking, having some trouble with my words there. If he's not coming up with something that seems new or interesting or exciting or controversial, no one gives a fuck. He knows, because there's no way he hasn't spent any time, that there's plenty of research studies that have shown the negative impacts that it has on people's feelings of moral responsibility to not believe in free will. He's arguing, oh, well, when you realize that free will is not a thing, you're going to be more moral, at least in Sam Harris's worldview, because you're going to be less vengeful, right? He's advocating, oh, you'd be more sympathetic to Hitler or something. And my initial reaction that I've talked about countless times is like, why would I be more sympathetic towards Hitler, who will say had no free will, than people who are disgusted and want to punish Hitler due to their own lack of free will and whatever's causing them to feel vengeful, but through their biology, their DNA, their environment, their thousands of years of evolution, that they've come to be this vengeful place. Why am I supposed to give more sympathy, or even equal sympathy, we'll say, to Hitler compared to someone who would like to punish Hitler? Now it's an extreme example, but even smaller versions of that. Like, it makes no fucking sense. And like I was just trying to say, there are all these studies that say people that don't believe in free will are less likely to give to charity, less gratitude, more inclined to cheat, all these negative things. There's no way that Sam Harris doesn't know this, but he just ignores it because what's a position that's going to make him some money, get him attention, is keep harping on that we don't have free will. Now, does this mean that we have free will? No, it doesn't mean that. But it still means he's dishonest about the ramifications of spreading this idea. The idea that it's just a positive, good thing, or even that it's just like kind of good, kind of bad. I think it's obvious that it's going to be mostly a negative thing if this becomes more of a widespread belief. And Sam Harris even acknowledges this himself to some degree when in a debate I hear him talking about, well, you don't want to tell kids about this. Because just because truth is only valuable as far as it's true and also useful. So he has this assumption that it's bad for a 10-year-old or maybe a 15-year-old or who knows, to be told that they don't have free will. But then once that they're an adult, then it's going to be okay. I am far more skeptical than he is about this. He doesn't seem skeptical at all about this. This idea that only a 10-year-old is going to be disturbed or act immorally with this information. I don't think that's true. I think this is a bigger problem if people start believing this. The other thing is, even though my tendency is to agree that we don't have free will, I do think that we obviously are very limited in our information about the world, and there is room to doubt this. There are brilliant scientists who seem to think, all the information is not in yet. Whether it's they have ideas about quantum physics or all kind of stuff that I don't really know enough about to comment deeply on, but I don't think it's necessarily as conclusive as Sam Harris is representing it, that we don't have free will. We might not have a good argument for why free will exists, but there's enough doubt, there's enough things about the brain that we don't understand to maybe be a little bit more cautious with our judgment, especially an idea that isn't necessarily, like Sam Harris would say, true and useful. It's not necessarily useful, this idea of lack of free will. I think it's primarily harmful, except for in this one way that he wants to manipulate it, that we're going to become more forgiving of people, which I don't think is what's going to happen. I think it kind of contributes to, at least within me, and I think within others, feelings of angst, nihilism, and so on. It's certainly not, I guess there's moments where I've looked at it in a way where it's like, oh, I guess not believing in free will, I can forgive myself for mistakes or feel less regretful. But in the end, at least for me personally, and what I would imagine how it would affect other people, it's far more anxiety provoking and pushes towards a sort of nihilistic outlook, as opposed to, which, nihilism doesn't have to equal debauchery and immoral behavior, although it certainly can. So I just think he undermines it's one thing if he said, we don't have free will, and this is really fucking dangerous and scary. Instead, he wants to paint this rosy picture of it, which is just totally bullshit and dishonest. And I think he knows it. I really do. So I think he's just a liar and an opportunist in that sense. And then I was going to talk about Elon Musk in a similar way. Talks about how there's only a 1 in billions chance that we're not in a simulation. And I was watching him in the podcast with Joe Rogan, and he says, well, despite saying this and the dark places it could lead, he remains an optimist, and it's important to be an optimist. He'd rather be an optimist and be wrong than be a pessimist and find out later that he's right. But that makes no fucking sense. I mean, then maybe we should err on the side of that this is base reality and that we're not in a simulation, because this idea that if people really started believing Elon Musk on this, that it's almost impossible that we're not in a simulation, the idea that this is going to lead to some sort of optimism, the Elon Musk's argument as well, we should just still try to push this life game as long as we can and try to enjoy it while we can and whatnot. If people really started adopting this idea and they really fully embrace this idea that we're in a simulation, it also is going to lead to nihilism, but nihilism in a sort of bad way, a sort of nihilism that will lead to despair and misery and lack of meaning and purpose. But he denies this. And it's especially easy, I think, for him too, because his life, he has a lot of money and power and intellect and resources, and he can still do all kind of crazy, cool, interesting things, be validated all the time. So for him in particular, maybe he still doesn't completely feel full of nihilistic despair because there's all this stuff going on. His simulation is more interesting than a lot of people's. Now, a guy who's working in a toll booth and doesn't really have a good way out of that job, and so that's pretty much the best he's got going for him, he may or may not still have some sort of idea to be, he can remain optimistic with a life working at a toll booth. It's going to be harder to distract himself with the sort of hedonistic pleasures of life and getting endless attention and validation. And, his simulation, if we're going to go with Elon Musk's idea of what, this reality is, a simulation, his simulation is much less interesting. So, once again, these are ideas, determinism, this idea that we're in a simulation, which also would be a deterministic idea, right? I mean, that would be even kind of a more depressing reality, I would say, in some way. I'd have to analyze why that is. Maybe perhaps being in a simulation isn't so depressing. On the surface, it certainly sinks in as a sort of depressing reality. Which also reminds me, one more point I want to make in this video is Sam Harris talks about this idea when this woman in the debate was saying, so what do I tell my child, my 18-year-old boy? Should I tell him he doesn't have free will because he's already making some stupid decisions as is? And, Sam Harris goes on to talk about how choices, even though they don't really exist freely, how what we do still matters and they still impact our lives. But if you really were to take it in fully, this idea that we actually have no real control over our choices and everything that's going to happen to us is already laid out, you don't think that this is going to demotivate people. Now, you might argue that they're already determined to be demotivated. It's already been laid out that they're going to hear Sam Harris's argument and either be inspired or depressed by it. But if you're trying to make some, trying to use a sort of scientific model of predictability, what do you think is going to happen? Do you not think that people will be demotivated by this if they think that really, even though they can have the illusion of choice, that ultimately all these choices are already sort of laid out in a sense, that they really have no control to change any of this? And Sam Harris just avoids this fucking reality. He avoids it because he wants to present himself as moral, but also have controversial ideas that'll make him money.